Hello everyone, Steve Goodwin here with my anchor test video number 141. Now this will be part 2 of Danforth versus Fortress, and in part 1, that was video number 101, I compared a 10-pound Fortress FX16 to a 20-pound Danforth H20. Now, arguably, that was a little bit unfair because that Danforth was half the weight and also considerably smaller in every dimension. Most importantly, it had less fluke area. Now, I'm going to compare the same size Danforth to a larger Fortress. This is a 15-pound FX23, and it is slightly larger in every dimension, including fluke area, but it is still a bit lighter weight. It's 15 pounds versus 20 pounds for the Danforth. Now, just to clarify, the original Danforth that I tested, that was a friend of mine's anchor, and that was a 20H model. This is an 18H model. They were built before the 20, and that's all they build now is the 20. Now, you might think, well, that's no good. This is going too small. But in actuality, this is the exact same size anchor as that 20H. If you go to the manufacturer's website, they give dimensions for both length, width, and fluke length. It's exactly the same. And indeed, this 18H Danforth weighs 20 pounds on my scale. So I'm virtually certain that the Danforth people, at some point in their production, realized that they were building a 20-pound anchor and calling it 18. They just simply changed the name of it. So, same size Danforth, but we've upped the size of the Fortress to what is arguably a little bit better comparison. Now, in a recent anchor test video, I made the discovery that both of my Danforth 18H fluke to shank angles were built incorrectly. Specifically, one direction was in the upper 30s, 38 or 39 degrees, while the other direction was in the low 30s, about 32 or so. Now, I've got lots of Danforth anchors and lots of Fortress anchors, and if I measure all of them with a protractor for angle, I find that low 30s is the predominant angle. None of them are perfect. You know, these are welded up on a bench by someone, and I'm assuming their fixtures are not perfectly precise. But, for instance, this small 5H Danforth, it runs about 32 degrees in one direction, 31 in the other. Now, what I've discovered, for the angles that are more open in the upper 30s, the anchor just has trouble setting. And I've shown that in several videos so far, and I'm going to show it again in this video. But in order to make accurate testing, I've gone ahead and modified one of my 18H anchors by welding. I've added material in here where the shank bears on its landing spot, thereby decreasing the fluke to shank angle to what I believe is the correct number, somewhere in the low 30s. 31 or 32 is really what we should be shooting for. More evidence that that is a big factor comes from the Fortress anchors. They are built with 2 fluke to shank angle settings, and if I install that shank in the more open 45-degree setting, boy, the anchor just cannot be set in any of the seabeds that I have. So, lots of evidence that says that the fluke angle is very critical for most seabeds, and the anchor that we're going to look at today in the test will indeed have the correct angles unless otherwise noted. Okay, one other thing that's going to be different about this video is for the first time I'm going to treat these pivoting fluke anchors just like their non-pivoting fluke cousins. In that, they're going to get tested in all of the seabeds. Well, all but one. I haven't been up to Susha Island with these, but the other 6 seabeds that I now test the 20-pound range anchors in, we're all going to see that here. Going to see straight line holding checks, veers, resets, the full gamut. I'll include them in all the ranking charts and the performance graphs, and we can make our own minds up of whether a pivoting fluke anchor is going to be comparable to the non-pivoting flukes. I personally, in the past, always figured that a pivoting fluke anchor wasn't really appropriate for the bow of my boat as a primary anchor, but forget about my prejudices. I'm just trying to test these anchors just exactly like every other, and you can make up your own mind about whether they're an appropriate anchor for the bow or perhaps some specialty use. Okay, we'll start off with the Danforth 18H here in the soft mud. The initial straight line set to 315 pounds was perfect. The veer portion, the anchor didn't move at all, which is odd, so all of the rotation of the anchor occurred during the final straight line portion, and the results there were 0.0 knots on the GPS up to and including 1,295 pounds, and then it was only at the final power setting of 1,325 that the anchors began moving and eventually reached 2 knots, again at that final over 1,300 pounds of pull. Here I'm cleaning off the anchor and chain by dragging at high speed behind the boat in a tight circle. Keeps the boat nice and clean, but unfortunately we don't get to witness the seabed that came up with the anchor after retrieval. I saw the anchor fly nicely under the boat. Now we'll look at the Fortress FX23 in that same soft mud test. And although you'll see at the end here the anchor does very, very well, the initial setting was problematic. What happened was that no matter how gentle and how easy I was pulling on the anchor, I'd let it start, I'd let it stop, it just would not engage. It was only holding about 100 pounds of pull, which is probably that's mostly just the chain friction on the bottom. But in any event, I went ahead just as a long shot. I gave the engine a good burst of power, and the boat lurched ahead at maybe 3 or 4 knots. And lo and behold, the anchor set. And this is not the first anchor that's done this. There's been several times now where I have used bursts of speed to get anchors to set. And very hard to explain why this is happening, but it is a true phenomenon. Unfortunately, it's not very realistic when you're setting an anchor in a larger boat that cannot lurch ahead very quickly. So although it's fascinating to witness, it's not a reliable way that you can use these anchors. And unfortunately, it's not the first time that Fortress anchor has had problems with initial setting, unlike the Danforths that seem to just get right with the business every time. But in any event, the anchor did eventually set, and I went ahead and completed the test. The veer held just fine from the boat, and the holding power was solid right up to about 1,200 pounds, and then it was at just under 1,300 pounds that the anchor started moving. So the holding power was very, very high once the anchor was set. Here's another setting attempt just to make sure that wasn't an anomaly with that odd setting behavior. Okay, we're back down to 0 boat speed and 100 pounds thrust. There's 135 and we're holding. Nope, 135 pounds and 0.4, 0.5, 0.6. Okay, the last time I actually got it to set by running the boat ahead kind of fast, a good burst of power. So let's try it again. Let's get it down to a stop. I'm assuming that this 100 pounds of thrust that it's able to hold might just be the chain laying on the bottom. Maybe part of the fluke is dug in, but let's give it a burst and see what it does. Okay, that was 3 knots. Sure enough, it stopped us. Would have never guessed a burst of speed would make an anchor set better, but it's done it. This is the 3rd time with 2 different anchors that's worked. Yeah, it's solid here. 165 pounds, no movement. So the Fortress was 2 for 2 at not setting unless I gave the boat a burst of power and speed. So the Danforth is clearly better here at initial setting, and they were very, very close. Too close to call on which one had the greater straight line holding power here in this soft mud seabed. Okay, we're back with the Danforth, still in the soft mud. This time it's a 180-degree reset test. I'm driving the boat directly up overhead at only 2 knots, sort of gentle, and then a nice 2,000 RPM burst after the anchor resets. And indeed, this anchor resets perfectly here. I ended up doing 7 passovers, and each and every time it was a very solid hookup. The first 2 we get clear images, although I couldn't quite tell if it was a pivot or if it was a backflip type reset. Whatever it was, it worked perfectly. Here's the third reset. We get the plunging camera, and at that point, all of our images are gone. But it was 7 for 7. The last two, I gave it full power on the bursts, full boat thrust. Absolutely solid. It was very, very impressive. This is one of the few times when an anchor really, really excelled over any other anchor I've tested. This protocol, this soft mud 180-degree set is fairly new, and I've only done a good handful of anchors. And again, this is by far the best anchor at this test so far. And now for the Fortress FX23 at this soft mud 180-degree reset. We had good pictures there of the anchor on the initial set, and it held a nice 3,000 RPM burst, no problem. So it was a great, solid set. But as we'll see on this next reset attempt, nothing. The anchor released. It's on its side and completely fouled with a ball of mud. You'll see that mud here when we show you the retrieval pictures, but that was it. Never went back and forth several times. Could not get the anchor to produce any more holding power. Boat was brought to a full stop multiple times, lots of bursts. Nothing could get this anchor to reset again. Okay, initial set was great. Held a 3,000 pound burst, no problem. And after that, no reset, zero. Very little thrust. I could hold the rode with my hand while the boat was idling forward. I went ahead and gave the Fortress another try. So here's take 2 for this soft mud 180-degree reset. So initial set here, you see the anchor dragging a little bit, kind of went a little faster, and sure enough, it locked right in. So there's a little peek at that other phenomenon we saw where this anchor likes to have some speed on to set in this seabed. Here's the first reset. The anchor came fully disengaged from the seabed, but with some speed on, the anchor reset nicely and held a nice burst. Here's the second reset. Boat was passing over about 2 knots, and I don't know if the anchor has spun around there. Now it finally did, and sure enough, the anchor is flying. There's maybe only about 2 knots of boat speed, but the anchor was flying along. Eventually, boat speed decayed down to less than a knot. Here, the anchor has recontacted the surface. It is hopelessly foul. The flukes are not articulating. Flukes are pointed skyward. No reset. Here's reset number 3. Looked like the anchor did a backflip, did a little bit of flying, but I think the flukes are now pointed downward, and when the anchor recontacts the seafloor, sets immediately, held a nice burst. So that's 2 successful resets out of the first 3 here, but that's all it could do. Out of both these series, all 10 tries, just got the 2 resets. From here on out, it was lots of flying, lots of flukes pointing upward and not able to articulate. We'll see at the tail end of this sequence when on the retrieval, we'll just see exactly how much or how little mud it takes to hopelessly foul these flukes pointed in the wrong direction once the anchor inverts. Okay, we had good, solid resets at the first and third try. Second, fourth, and fifth, nothing. No resistance at all. So that took a little bit of force to get that fluke to move past that mud. I didn't see a shell or a stick, so not sure why it wasn't resetting. Maybe the footage will show that it was upside down and not able to articulate. It certainly was enough mud and resistance to keep the flukes from just articulating under their own weight. I'm going to say it was maybe about 5, 6, 8 pounds of force at the tips to get them to move. Okay, now we've traveled over to the clean, loose sand test site, and we see the anchor developed a bit of a list on its initial dig in, and it never got level. and that's probably a factor as to why the anchor failed to make it to the target of 535 pounds. We see a full release there at about 400 pounds, and that was it. It never developed any more holding power after that. Now this clean seabed, as I've stated before, sometimes an anchor will come up with some sand adhered to the fluke, and my conclusion is that down about a foot or so there is some binder that may affect some anchors' ability to fully penetrate this seabed. But certainly there's lots of anchors that do real well here. This one though, however, had trouble, so we'll give it another try. So as we can see, the anchor landed perfectly aligned with the chain this time, and the boat's pull direction is also aligned, so perfect set. However, it still ended up with a list immediately after its initial dig in, and unfortunately wasn't able to hold the target of 535 pounds once again. So clearly the anchor's having trouble fully bearing in this seabed. This time, however, the anchor did reset and was able to hold the 535 target. I did commence with the veer, and it did hold the boat throughout the veer. However, we see that the stock is sticking out of the seabed for the entire time, and then immediately when I started ramping up power in a straight line, had a full release at 620 pounds of thrust and no reset. Okay, here's the Fortress FX23 in that same clean sand test. We'll see my haphazard deployment has resulted in the anchor sort of falling over onto the chain, but it orients itself just fine as I start giving it a tug. Digs the toes in perfectly in alignment with everything, but it was no good. Just like that Danforth, developed a list and had a full release at 465 pounds. I did keep pulling. It was, I think, another release at a similar number, but eventually, as we see here, it did dig in, and I did commence a veer at the target of 535 pounds of thrust. You see that sort of arc-shaped track there in the sand. That's where the chain emerges, and whenever we see those compact arcs, that tells us that the anchor is spinning around and not moving very far away from its initial spot. So I'm going to call that a near-perfect veer. And then here on the straight line portion, not a lot of motion, but it was able to hold the full boat thrust up to 1,325 pounds. Just a touch of motion, so very, very good performance after that not so great initial setting performance. Okay, now we've moved over to the Cobblestone seabed. First up will be the Danforth. No one's going to expect much performance here in this type of seabed with these pivoting fluke anchors. In fact, really no anchor can do well here, other than perhaps maybe some large ship anchor. But in any case, this anchor did manage to consistently hold 135 pounds before releasing, and once it held 165. So I'll go ahead and rate it at 165, but it was marginal indeed. This stone was just loose in the flukes, and I think it just picked up there at the tail end of the test and was not a factor. So this is the Fortress in the Cobblestone, and its performance was even less than that Danforth. In fact, we might even say that it was doing close to nothing. It did hold 100 pounds of boat thrust. However, a good portion of that is likely just the chain laying on the seafloor. We got most of an 80-foot section of chain laying in the rocks there, and again, maybe half of this holding is just the chain. It kind of brings up an interesting test for me sometime. Maybe do some anchor tests with just chain only, no anchor, and see what kind of holding we can get out of some chain. But anyway, very ineffective in the Cobblestone for the Fortress. Okay, now we're out on the Pacific coast at Ocean Shores, Washington. This was part of my surf sand testing. It was depicted in video number 126 about 1 year ago. You might go back and watch that if you haven't seen it. In any event, I'm pulling with the truck and the winch is attached here. Unfortunately, the Danforth did not set, and the reason for it was the improper fluke angle. I was unaware of it at this time, and I tried it twice. The first time I just set the anchor on the surface. The second time here I gave it a kick, helped it into the ground, but it didn't matter. It just popped right back out. Again, the fluke angle was just built wrong, and it's I think it was 38 or 39 degrees, and it should have been down in the low 30s.
No good. Popped right out. Okay, even after burying it by hand, still no set, or actually it popped out immediately. So this sand apparently is too hard for a Danforth.
And once again, I was unaware at the time that there was a fluke angle issue. So now we'll give the Fortress a try here. A little more explanation. The purpose of the wheels there is to elevate the road to create some scope. Without the wheels, we'd just be pulling with infinite scope, and I like to anchor or test anchors with sort of a real-world angle of pull. It ends up being 12 feet of chain there, and the axle of those wheels is about 2 feet above the seabed. So I call it a 6-to-1 scope. And well, here's what happened with that Fortress anchor.
12, 13, 1350, 1340, 1330, 1320.
So those are kilograms I'm calling out there, and the anchor ended up holding 3,850 pounds at its peak.
No way! I gotta go get a shovel.
So it would have been easy to shorten up the chain to, say, 1-to-1 scope and then use the winch to retrieve this anchor. The wheels are built real strong, so it could have handled that load, but I wanted to get a real first-hand idea of just how deep and how tenacious that anchor was buried into that seabed, and it really was.
Holy.
Next site is the new Cobble-sand seabed. This is a place where there's a layer of golf ball size cobble on top of quite pure sand underneath. Now, the Danforth anchor had not yet been modified, and indeed it landed in the bad side, meaning it has too great of a fluke angle, and indeed the anchor just would not set. It only made about 135 pounds of holding. So I was aware of it at this time, so I went ahead and retested it, being very careful here to keep the anchor oriented with the correct side up, or the proper fluke angle, and it made all the difference in the world. There was more than double the holding. Still not great. It was solid at 480 pounds, and then we had a full release at the next power increment. It was a bit like the clean sand seabed, where this anchor just wasn't quite as good as many other anchors. But that's what we get, and there wasn't really much of a reset after this final release.
Okay, 22 solid. It does appear that it stayed on the correct side with the smaller angle. No damage here. Yeah, 22, 24 full release, anchor flying away.
And here is the Fortress in the Cobble-sand seabed. We're going to see right away that the anchor does a better job of penetrating. We'll see the anchor mostly covered here. This first sort of peak that it has was actually the same as the Danforth peak. It was real solid at 315 pounds. Here it is, just completely buried. But then at the next power increment, it did have a full release. She let go fully, and the good thing though is that it reset, and it reset even better. This time there wasn't really that heaping going on. The anchor really was truly buried all the way. I don't see much of the chain being buried, so it's just under the surface, not deep at all. But the holding was much better this time. It was solid at 535 pounds of thrust, and then here at the next increment up towards 600, we'll see a full release. And I'm not sure if it reset or not, but again, clearly this anchor, for some reason, just likes this seabed better than the Danforth. much the same as the clean sand seabed was. Okay, now we've moved over to the original seabed where I started all this anchor testing madness. This is the sandy mud site. It's the Danforth 18H. We saw a perfect initial set. The test here is a veer, a constant 535 pounds of pull as the boat swings through 180 degrees. We are watching this footage at 8 times camera speed to keep the video at a reasonable length. We can see there in the lower left-hand part of the screen, you can see where the chain is disrupting seabed as it arcs around, and the anchor really hasn't moved. It was just perfect set and perfect up to 120 degrees of veer where it had an immediate release and no reset due to that ball of mud. Here's take 2 for that Danforth in the same test. I'm just giving it another try just to verify the results, and it's largely the same. We've got an immediate set, and it immediately held the full protocol here of 535 pounds. We are watching once again at 8 times camera speed. Boat starts arcing around and the anchor just stays put perfectly. But if you notice very carefully toward the latter part of the veer, we do start to see the anchor listing. In fact, one of the stalks emerges from the seabed, and that's the point where I'm going to bring it back down to normal camera speed. If you look down at the very bottom of the screen, about in the middle, you can just see the stalk starting to emerge. Okay, now we're at normal speed, and we'll just watch this, and we're right up near the end of the veer. I'm at 180 degrees. Of course, I have no idea what's going on the top side, and what I normally do to indicate that I have reached 180 degrees is I just chop the power momently, and just right as I do that, the anchor was letting go. And sure enough, as soon as I add a little bit more thrust, off the anchor goes, no reset. So once again, the anchor really has failed to stay horizontal in the seabed, followed by full release. Here's the Fortress FX23 in that same test. Again, it's the sandy mud here, 5-to-1 scope. Both these anchors are getting the long chain for this test, same as all the other 20-pound non-pivoting fluke anchors that I've done. And I'll mention that there's numerous of those non-pivoting fluke anchors that can execute this test perfectly, in that they don't develop lists, they don't move, and they can basically hold the full power of the boat at the end of the veer. But neither of these anchors can do that same high quality here. So far, it looks like the Fortress is meeting the standard. No motion whatsoever in the initial straight line and throughout this veer, but right about here we'll start to see, yep, there's the stalk emerging, and sure enough, the anchor releases. It actually made it through the veer. It was at about 685 pounds of the straight line portion that it did release, reset, and then release again at an even lower value.
Large chunk of seabed fell off the anchor just before I started filming it here. Pretty clearly mud-fouled. I have not cleared any seaweed from the anchor. No way would that articulate on its own. I'm having to push very hard.
Next is a straight line holding check with the propeller here in the sandy mud seabed. This is with short chain, 5-to-1 scope, and this is the Danforth 18H. Turbidity is so high we're not going to see much, so I'll just get right to the point. And that is that the anchor set right away and was solid at 685 pounds of pull. Then at full release here at 790 and no reset. Okay, now for the Fortress anchor for the propeller check here in the sandy mud. Now right off the bat we see that the camera tether is lodged underneath and behind the anchor, and I don't think that's a factor here with this failure we're going to see. And the reason I think that is because I have seen maybe a dozen times where the slightly smaller FX16 anchor does this exact same failure mode. And that is, in this sandy mud seabed at 5-to-1 scope, these anchors only fully penetrate about half the time. It's really a 50-50 gamble whether or not it will really dig down and make good holding power. The answer to this problem is simply to use longer scope. But 6-to-1 and higher, the rate of successful deep penetrations goes up considerably. Okay, here's take 2 for the Fortress, and it does a whole lot better. Got the camera rolling at 8 times speed, and I'll just show you the whole sequence. That initial set is just fine, has a little bit of a list, but it straightens right out. Anchor ended up just about holding the full thrust of the boat, but it did have a release at the final full power setting. So I'm going to rate it here at 1,295 pounds. Not a lot of motion. Toward the end, it starts moving a bit here. We get the plunging camera phenomena, and then had a full release. Not sure if it was going to reset or not, but my guess is not, given the large glob of mud on retrieval. Okay, last test we'll show you today is the 180-degree reset in the sandy mud. This is done with short chain at 5-to-1 scope. I'll mention that the non-pivoting fluke anchors, they get this same test at only 3.5-to-1 scope, and there are many that can do extremely well, resetting each and every time quite quickly. It's certainly not the case for these pivoting fluke anchors. We see here on the first reset there's a considerable amount of dragging, and I'm not going to show you all 10 of these because it gets quite lengthy, but here's the rundown. Out of the 10 reset attempts, 3 of them there was no reset. I stopped, started, slow, fast, absolutely could not get them to hook up 3 out of those 10 times. The other 7 I did get solid hookups eventually, but many times it took a lot of dragging along. Sometimes the anchor was flying and, you know, well above the seabed, and counterintuitively that actually I think is a help. As we can see here, as the anchor is flying along, seabed is being washed away by the high speed of the water, and then once a boat speed decays down to say about a knot or so, again, we're not going real fast, that's probably less than 2 knots when it was flying there, down at about 1 knot, the anchor contacts the seabed and pivots and does reconnect and stops the boat. So that's a success of a sort. Now, of those 7 relatively successful resets, only 1 or 2 happened, say, within maybe 5 anchor lengths. The rest were really long drags. Of course, there's plenty of opportunity to pick up debris and seaweed when you're dragging an anchor that long. So again, I question just how well we can say that these were resetting in a reliable manner. And now for the Fortress at the 180-degree reset here in the sandy mud seabed. Nice initial set, and then here's the first reset. Kind of a rotation, not quite fully disengaged, but enough to dislodge it and cause it to drag along here. And I almost think this is the worst case scenario, because as it's dragging, it's picking up seabed just about as fast as it can flush it away. And you're going to see here on the next reset attempt, the anchor does a backflip and immediately starts flying. Now, I'm not going real fast with this anchor. I'm kind of treating it gently. I'm only going about 2 knots overhead. And sure enough, the anchor is flying well under 2 knots here. So you can see that the seabed is being flushed away. And if you fly along here long enough, it flushes enough seabed away such that when it does contact the seabed, the anchor will pivot and it sets right away. Now, a lot of you might think, well, hey, when your boat's being pushed around at anchor by the wind, it's not going to be moving at 2 knots. But if you're using a really long rope portion of your rode, there's a certain rubber band effect that can load up, and if the wind has switched directions 180 degrees, or the current for that matter, and then suddenly the anchor dislodges, that taking up of that elastic rode could easily have the anchor momentarily going faster than 2 knots, or certainly fast enough to cause the anchor to fly. So I don't think this is entirely unrealistic behavior in the real world of anchoring. Obviously, I've had to try to make a test that's repeatable and something I can film, and that requires the use of a boat being dragged back and forth and using the engine. So again, it's not perfect, but that's the best I can come up with. In any event, here once again we're flying along. This time I slowed down prior to enough seabed washing away. The anchor has now settled back down on the seabed, but it won't pivot. It's got too much stuff jammed in between the sides of the fluke and the shank, and no reset. In fact, on all 10 of these attempts, I only got 2 successful resets of any quality whatsoever. All the rest, it was just lots and lots of dragging, flying, and no resetting. So if we take a quick scan at some of my performance numbers I've got there on the screen, we see right away that the Fortress clearly dominates in terms of holding factor. It's better than the Danforth in every category except for the Cobblestone, and it's not by a small margin. The biggest factor was the surf sand. Of course, the Danforth was defective for that test, but we see just a truly colossal number. 248 holding factor, surf sand for the Fortress. Absolutely amazing. Other categories are very high as well. Soft mud holding factor was 88 for the Fortress, more than 88 for the clean sand. Holding factor, for sure, Fortress gets it. But in terms of resetting, the Danforth is far better. It had 7 out of 7 in the soft mud versus 2 out of 10 for the Fortress. And then in the sandy mud reset, the Danforth was 7 out of 10. Pretty marginal. A lot of those took a long time to get it to reset, but the Fortress was only able to reconnect 2 out of 10. And in terms of initial setting, both anchors have their weak points. In the soft mud, we recall the Fortress anchor required me to have those bursts of power to get it to set with the long chain. And the Danforth, well, it was marginal initial setting at times as well, such as the Cobble-sand seabed. Here's a graphic depiction of the Danforth and Fortress anchors, along with the non-pivoting fluke 20-pound range anchors. And obviously, if these 2 pivoting fluke anchors manage to penetrate and properly engage the seabed, they have the potential to produce some truly amazing holding factors. Here's the latest ranking chart with the Danforth and Fortress anchors included. I'm going to go ahead and leave them in their own sort of group down at the bottom with any other pivoting fluke anchors that come along, such as that Navy anchor that has yet to be fully tested. I think it'll be best to just leave them separate together so that they can be compared amongst themselves. They are, after all, quite a different animal from these non-pivoting fluke anchors. Okay, so which is the better anchor? Danforth or Fortress? And the answer, it depends. It's going to depend on what your priorities are. If you're looking for the ultimate holding power per unit weight of anchor, I think the Fortress will win pretty much against any anchor. If you're looking for more reliable setting and resetting and other behavior, I think the Danforth is a bit better than the Fortress. A lot of it has to do with this wide gap between the flukes. There's just more room for the shank to pass through in case there is mud packed into the anchor. We saw a couple times on retrieval where the Fortress pivoting action was clearly blocked. There's just not a lot of room left over for this wider shank to pass through that narrower gap between the fluke halves. Okay, I may continue with this Danforth Fortress study in the future as I gain more seabeds or perhaps more testing protocols, but until then, I think the case is closed. I'm still convinced that for my needs and around here in these seabeds, the pivoting fluke anchors are not the best choice for your primary bow anchor. I'll stick with non-pivoting flukes for that and continue to consider these a specialty anchor. Now, there may be parts of the world, maybe a place with extremely soupy mud, where the non-pivoting fluke anchors just don't work at all. In that case, you're going to be forced to use one of these pivoting fluke anchors as your primary. Another case might be in the tropics. It's a place I've never really anchored, and there may be miles and miles of just pure clean sand with no chance at all of fouling these anchors. That might be another case where these might be a good choice. But again, for around here, these are going to be relegated to a stern type or secondary specialty situation. All right, thanks everybody for watching and otherwise donating or supporting these anchor testing efforts of mine. As always, anchor safely. So long.